Welcome to Peninsula Seniors Out and About. We're at the Western Museum of Flight in Torrance. Let's go see what Cindy has for us today.
Welcome everyone to the Western Museum of Flight. I'm Cindy Maka, the director. We the people, of course, owe an incalculable debt of gratitude to all of those who served. And although that gratitude from many came far later than it should have, most Americans today quite rightly have come to realize how great that debt was. Many of those who served also owed a debt of gratitude to one another, perhaps none more so who came home safely due to the heroic efforts of the search and rescue air crews who brought them back from harm's way. We are honored today to have one of those pilots. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege to introduce to you Captain Mark Liebman.
I have a question for the audience. Since Cindy started off taking polls, how many members of the audience are Air Force or Army pilots? Okay, how many naval aviators or Coast Guard or Marine aviators? All right, just so everybody knows, for the Army guys in the room and the Marines in the room, I'm going to talk slowly and have big pictures. The Air Force guys, this is your special briefing. Unfortunately, it's not at the O Club. And the Navy guys, just hang in, you'll understand. Okay, just so everybody knows, I was not a helicopter pilot by choice. I was voluntold. I'm supposed to stick here right at the microphone, so I got to do this. And by voluntold, I meant is after I landed on the boat, carrier qualified, I wanted to go fly the A-1 Skyraider or jets or something with more than one engine. And the time was if you're the first guy in the class, you got your preference, and I was number one out of about 40. And I saw the first 25 guys being sent to Ellison, and I went to the admin office and said, there's got to be a mistake. I said, I was number one, says here number one, I'm supposed to get my first choice. And how come numbers 22 and number 23 are going to jets, and I'm not? So obviously it's a jet spot. And he looked at me and said, Ensign, you're going to go fly helicopters, or you can DOR, which is drop on request. And so I was stupid enough to ask the next question, which is why? How come these guys got jets and I didn't? The deal is I'm number one, blah, 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 blah. And he looked at me and said, are you familiar with the term RHIP? Rank has its privileges? And I said, yes, sir. And he said, well, the father of the guy who's number 23 had 2 stars on his collar. Next question. I flew primarily 2 helicopters in the Navy. I've got some time in the H-860 and the SH-60B, but for the purposes of this conversation and this presentation, I flew mostly the H-2 and the H-3. I've actually flown almost every model of the H-2 in the inventory, or that was in the inventory, and almost every model of the H-3 that was in the inventory. The top one, the H-2, was kind of like a sports car. It was small, about 12,000 pounds maximum gross weight, had a rotor diameter of about 44 feet, and was actually fun to fly. It was not a reliable helicopter. Some genius that came and decided to put the avionics compartment in the nose and split it with a rubber gasket, so every time you flew for the rain, things in the avionics compartment would short out, and if you were then partial panel on instruments. The H-3 was like a Suburban or a Ford Excursion. It was like a sport utility vehicle. It's got a big cabin. It was designed for anti-submarine warfare. It was built in 3 different countries, the United States, Italy, and the United Kingdom. And it's flown by 19 different countries. There are still some in military services today. There are some being flown by the Drug Enforcement Administration in Afghanistan in doing drug kind of things. And it's a pretty cool helicopter, but it's not real maneuverable. And as you can tell, it was designed to land in the water. It does have a boat hull. And if you land slowly at 3 to 5 knots, wings level, in a calm sea state, it will float. That's assuming you don't rip off one of the sponsons and it rolls on its side. If you shut the rotor's blades down, the helicopter is top heavy and it will roll on its back and go blub, 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 and if you don't get out, it'll ruin your whole day. The other thing about the H-3 is the geniuses who designed it, since it was designed for flying around at sea level and in an anti-submarine warfare environment, which means they're hunting for submarines, they also didn't design it for being shot at. So the hydraulic lines went across the top part of the fuselage on the left side, the port side, and the fuel lines to the engines went on next to each other about 1 inch apart on the right side or starboard side, so one bullet would take them all out. You lose hydraulics in the H-3 and you're dead. The helicopter is literally uncontrollable, or if the bullet took out the two fuel lines, you run out of gas and you crash. So when they made the armored version of it, which I'll talk about in a second, that was one of the things besides putting armor plate and self-sealing fuel tanks in, they moved around. We flew with a crew of 4 to 5 people, typically 2 pilots and 2 or 3 enlisted guys. This slide is my tome to the bravest people in the world. These are the enlisted air crewmen who flew in the back, who in peacetime will willingly leap out of a helicopter in the middle of some dark, stormy night to go help a survivor, with the hope, emphasize the word hope, that we could find them both again and pick them up and bring them back to the ship. These kids, and I was 22, 23 years old, so I wasn't much older, were typically about 18, 19 years old. They went through a swimmer school, which about 60% don't make it, and then they went to corpsman school. Today, the schools that they go through are tougher, and I know many what they call PJs or pararescue men. It's now a specialized rate in the Navy, and I got news for you. I would rather have one of these kids operate on me than some doctors. They're that good. And they're really, really quality people. So if you ever know a PJ or a rescue air crewman that flew for the Navy, the Air Force, Marine Corps, whatever, give them a big hug and say thank you. And oh, by the way, in Vietnam, they did this for 80 extra bucks a month. Okay, this is the H-2C or the HH-2C model. It was the only version that had any kind of combat capability. It has a little chin turret you can see on the back of the front. It had a 3-barrel minigun, which I'll show you a little bit about in a second. It had armor-plated seats. It had self-sealing tanks. The cabin was really tiny. By the time you put the armor plate, the ammo tray in the back, there was not room for a whole lot of people. The other exciting thing about this minigun installation, which fired a couple 2,000 rounds a minute, was the fact it did not have the capability to mechanically safe the weapon. So if you landed hard, which you do every time you land on the back end of a ship, it would tend to kick off the 3 rounds in the barrel. Tend to piss off the captain of the ship and the landing signal officer standing out in front of you. Needless to say, it was taken off. But the H-2, when it first came out, only had 1 engine. It had barely had enough power to turn the rotor blades. And if you took off with a half a bag of fuel or half fuel load, you could fly about 50 miles. And if you had to hover to pick somebody up, you had to dump fuel out so you get light enough to hold a hover. And then you had to go find some place really close to get gas to get back to wherever you're going. They then put 2 engines in it in the C model, and basically the same transmission, same rotor blades, so you now had enough power to unscrew the rotor blades, and so much power you couldn't control it directionally at high power settings. So they put the 4th blade on it, which is in the armored version first, and then what they call the D model, and so that became a pretty good helicopter. In the H-3, this one's in my logbook, by the way, back before it was converted to the HH-3A. And this one was, they made 12 of these, and they put self-sealing fuel tanks in it. They put armored seats in it, armor around some of the vital components, and they had a 6-barrel minigun in the back. This is a real argument stopper. We never fired them at more than 2,000 rounds a minute because you burn up the barrels. Changing the barrels in the middle of a firefight is not a really good idea. And we carried the helicopters carried 8,000 rounds of ammunition for it. We had another M60, or the helicopters had another M60 out the passenger door, and then we had the personal weapons. The exciting thing about this, when they put all the armor plate in, the self-sealing tanks, fuel, full ammo load, the minigun, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and oh, by the way, 5 guys, the helicopter's design weight was 19,600 pounds. The helicopters routinely, with all that stuff in it, was around 24,600 pounds. Gross, about 25% over gross, which made takeoffs in this thing entertaining. And everybody thinks that the Navy operates only helicopters and aircraft only off aircraft carriers. Yes, we do that. We operate off helicopters with fixed wing and rotary wing, but a lot of the helo guys operate off the back end of these things, which we call small boys. Back in those days, they're known as destroyers, or in this case, this is the Sterret, and I'll talk a little bit about the Sterret in a second. It was known as a destroyer leader guided missile, mainly because they had an extra space on it for a flag officer. And now they're known as, or before it was scrapped, it was known as a cruiser. The important thing about this slide is the chart on the left. You'll notice it has the landing markings in a nice, neat X. If you can see the picture of the ship, you'll notice it's not in the same place. The publications generally followed about a year behind this. The ships would come out of modifications, and 90% of the time, the deck was not the way it was diagrammed in the book, which made your approach, your first pass, really you'd basically sit off the side of the ship and look at it to make sure you could get in. The other exciting thing is you notice those 3 blocks up there? If you put the main mounts of an H3 on those 3 blocks, you had all of 6 feet between the rotor blades and something solid. If you had an H2, you had an extra 6 feet. And we landed on these ships in day and night, good weather and bad, pitching and rolling decks, and I'll talk about that. The real problem in these ships is getting from that kind of state to the helicopter sitting on the deck. That's actually on the sterret. That's an H3 with its blades folded, and you can see how much extra room you have. You land a little bit left, you put a wheel in the netting on the side, the helicopter rolls off, and you have a bad day, and the captain of the ship is pissed because he's got a fire on the fantail. You land a little at aft, and the rotors cut off the tail boom, and it's a question of whether or not the helicopter explodes. And you have a bad day, and again, the captain of the ship is pissed because it's career over. Say nothing, he's got a fire. And this is why I say this is somewhat interesting, and it keeps one focused, and is why I tell my kids and grandkids why I really have a lot of gray hair. Day or night, good weather and bad, we'd find the ship, which in itself was sometimes an entertaining experience because no ship I've ever flown to was ever where it said it would be. And before the days of GPS and inertial nav systems, we literally would find them. And what you would do is you know the general area and you'd look for the wake. The trouble is if they're going 2 or 3 knots, the wake doesn't go very far. Steaming around 10 or 12 knots and the wake's 2 or 3 miles long. So we would find the wake, find the ship, and we'd creep up alongside, and about 200 feet from the ship and about 50 to 70 feet over the water, we'd stop, do a power check, make sure we had enough power, and we're just outside this thing and there's little circular stuff, and it's known as the burble. Essentially what it was the gas coming, the exhaust fumes coming out of the engines. In this case, the sterret or the cruisers those days burned diesel fuel, and not diesel fuel, Navy fuel oil distillate number 2, and it burned like diesel fuel, had all kinds of particulates in it. You could taste it. It was gritty, and it put a slime all over the windshield if you stayed there long enough. And so you'd sit in the burble breathing the stack gas. You always, the ships are always briefed as when you were making an approach not to do what they call blow tubes, which is to clean out the exhaust tubes, because if they did it, you were literally in a black cloud for about 30 seconds. So once you got into the burble, you know that the deck was the way you should be. And oh, by the way, when the ship is going through the water with the wind 30 degrees to the port side, if there's a sea state, it's not doing up and down, nose up, stern down. It's going into the sea in a quartering manner, which means it's corkscrewing. I've landed on ships where the deck was going up 10 to 20 feet, up and down, say nothing of the roll, of 20 to 30 degrees. It makes it entertaining, and it does keep one focused. So you get across, so what happens, you pause and you slide over the deck. You get into a hover about 3 to 4 feet over the deck. You get it centered, and you have a enlisted guy guiding you. And when you got to about 3 or 4 feet over the deck, he crosses the wands, and you plant it firmly on the deck. You do not pussyfoot around. You just lower the collective, which is the thing, the control that controls the pitch of the pitch of all the rotor blades, and you literally plant it on the deck. And if it's not slick, and the helicopter doesn't slide around, you got 2 guys coming out of the side, chuck and change you down, and at that point you are safely, theoretically, on the deck. And at which point you find out how close you came to putting one of the wheel on either side or the tail wheel over the back. Now, again, we did this day and night, good weather and bad. At nighttime, or the takeoffs were also entertaining. Remember I told you the helicopter, particularly the H3s, were operating over gross weight. The H2s, which my friend Charles Del Campo and I flew, as well as this one, we were typically about 1,000 to 1,500 pounds over gross weight. Not as bad as the H3. So here was the technique that they used. You spool up the engines as fast as they go. You take the rudder blades, you spin it up to as fast as you could turn it, which is about 104% of RPM. Signal to have the chocks pulled out, the chains untied, at which point the pilot flying the aircraft, which is typically the aircraft commander, takes the collective, pulls it up around his ears, about that fast. The helicopter groans, shudders, makes all kinds of obscene noises because it's telling you, hey, dummy, I'm over gross, we're too heavy. And it then starts to get light on the wheels. About time you get down to about 98%, you're thinking, may or may not get it, 96%. It's light on the wheels. As soon as the wheels come off the deck, the pilot dives, slides off to the left, dives for the water, which in the case of the sterret, or most of these ships, is about 30 to 40 feet below. The helicopter raises the wheels so you don't catch them on the edge of the deck if you settle a little bit. And what you're trying to do is get to what's known as translational lift, at which point the helicopter rotor blades generate about 15 to 20% more lift. And you're also hoping, and you get to about 20 knots to get to that. So you're diving for the water, and then you dish out about 5 to 10 feet over the water. Again, we do this day and night. before GPS, before night vision goggles, and we had a radar altimeter, which if it was really calm, didn't work. So it was, it's kind of an entertaining thing, and then you get there, you dish out 20 knots, and you begin to milk the collective, pull it up, droop down, lower the collective, pull it up, droop down. 5 to 10 miles from the ship, you might get 60 knots and begin to climb. Now, the other exciting part of this, if you did it wrong, you basically went in the water and you're dead. The helicopter would come apart, roll over its back, and blah, 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 away you go. So that's how we took off, okay? And so we got off the ship. Now, everybody likes to think the Navy, particularly the guys in the Army, we had nice, clean staterooms. The staterooms really weren't staterooms to live in. They were really storage facilities for all the crap we bought in the exchanges at Subic Bay and in Hong Kong and in Japan. This is Charles and I's stateroom. You can see the stuff hanging in rafters. We have a crossbeam to keep it shoved in place in the sea state. And you can see the drawer. So those are pictures of my lovely wife of now 47 years. And that's kind of what it looked like. You can see the wicker chairs somebody bought and wanted to bring home, but it was really a storage facility. It really wasn't a living place. I can show you pictures of our racks, but that would get obscene. You notice that we cut out one of the boxes so we could use the speaker in the box, and so it was wired through because the stereo systems we bought were there. This picture has 3 stories to it. One, it's a young lieutenant junior grade, Mark Liebman. Actually, I think I was a lieutenant by this time. And my beard back in those days was bright carrot red. Someplace in my lineage, even though I'm half Spanish and half German, there was an Irishman. So let's start with the easy part about this, which is the life vest. When we first headed to Vietnam, we were wearing Mae Wests that were yellow that you saw in the World War II and Korean War vintage movies. We had a firearm, a K-bar knife, a shark repellent, and dye marker. Then we got these fancy vests, which we modified. We put bullets on the outside for tracer rounds and stuff like that. Now, back to the beard. I started growing it about halfway through my tour in Vietnam, and this is 1970. The ship comes back into Norfolk, and we're getting off the ship, and 6,000 horny wives are running towards the guys on the ship, and there's 6,000 horny guys going to their wives on the ship, and my wife runs right past me. I mean, and so I run to catch her up. I tap her on the shoulder, and I said, "Sweetheart, it's me. Hello." I start to give her a kiss. I get the stiff arm. She points at my beard and says, "That's gross. I'm not kissing you until that comes off." If you saw my face the next day, it looked like a bear or cat took its claws and just went down the sides of my cheeks. Since that day, I shave every day, pretty much every day, and I have never worn a mustache or a beard since that day. And like I said, I'm still married to this lovely, wonderful woman. This thing down in the lower left-hand corner, it was done as a spoof. It's proof that helicopter pilots can get traps. Traps is the Navy slang term for an arrested landing on an aircraft carrier by a fixed-wing airplane. So somebody in this audience had this brilliant idea because they were making a big deal about the Air Wing commander was going to make his last trap at the last day of the cruise, and it's a big deal in the Navy. So somebody in this room, sitting in the back, comes up with this brilliant idea, and we decided to make our own tailhook. And so I took off on the last mission. We flew around, and the F4 guy traps aboard, and we said we want to come around, ask the primary we're clear to land. He says, "Roger, Angel 40, come aboard." And so we said we want to make a traditional pass. They said, "Roger, ball." And so we came past the LSO platform outboard, and I called, I can't remember the Courage Tower, which is the call sign in America. I said, "Angel 40, all down, hook down." There was a pregnant silence. We knew on the landing signal officer's platform there's a guy with a pair of binoculars looking at us because he did this to everybody else. Everybody reported landing gear down, hook down. And of course I did the other thing. I said state 1 point something because we didn't carry much fuel, which is the fuel state. So I came around and he says, "Roger, call the ball." So I come around, line up the meatball and say, "Angel 40, got a ball." And he says, "Roger, ball, continue." So I trundle down towards the deck. The idea is to land to catch the number 3 wire. It's the 3rd wire from the aft end of the ship. And so what we did is we touched down just short of the 3 wire, rolled in. When the air crewman told me that it was snagging the wire, we stopped. And therefore, helicopter pilots can get arrested landings. A lot of people don't know the coastline of Vietnam is pretty long. It's about 1,000 miles from Haiphong to the mouth of the Mekong River. Some people measured it 1,200 miles. I've seen 1,500 miles. I've never actually measured it, but it's a long damn way. As a crow flies between Hanoi and Saigon, it's about 650 miles. So it's, again, not a short distance. Now, most of the fighting and most of the glory that you hear about helicopters is over South Vietnam. Not too many people knew that the Navy maintained 2 destroyers or cruisers up at a place called North SAR and South SAR, and that Yankee Station was roughly about 100 miles off the coast of the DMZ. Dixie Station, which is where they flew close air support for from South Vietnam, was down around off in the Mekong River Delta, again, about 100 miles to sea. Probably 90% of the flying I did was between Yankee Station, North SAR, South SAR, and that whole neck of the woods. And not a lot of people know the Navy was doing this, which is, and I'll show you some interesting statistics at the end of this presentation, because one of the reasons, the mission that I chose to accept when I started doing this Grandpa, What Did You Do During the Vietnam War presentation, was to tell everybody that the Navy made combat rescues, and I'll show you the actual statistics. When I did this in front of an Air Force Academy Association chapter in Dallas, there was a lot of gnashing of the teeth because the truth came out. And I'll share the truth. I'm going to hold you in suspense. Okay, so North and South SAR, the ships typically orbited or had a station about 25 miles from the beach. That's the shoreline. And then the helicopters that they carried, single plane deaths, would then launch to support strikes, basically sitting off the egress routes. And they would orbit somewhere between a mile to a mile and a half off the beach at 200 to 300 feet, day and night, good weather and bad. The reason they were down that low was twofold, particularly at night. It kept them out below the radar horizon and below the visual horizon. Because in a helicopter, you don't go smoking along at 400 knots like a jet. Thundering along in an H2 or an H3, you're lucky to get 120. I've never seen 120 in an H3 that's fully loaded. 110 was about as fast as you can get. And a really light H2, I got 130 out of it. In Texas, where I live, we have state highways where you have reasonable speed limits like 85. And there are roads where they're not well patrolled, and there are people doing 110 knots. So basically as fast as a helicopter goes. And this puts a whole different perspective on flying in combat, where the fast mover guys say, hey, speed is life. Oh, yeah? Try this at 110 knots. And it also means that you're very vulnerable. We're also down in the weeds, particularly the Vietnam guys the guys who flew Hueys in Vietnam. You know, they're down amongst the trees. And as I tell people, the fast movers at 10,000 feet and above, yeah, they can shoot a missile at you, but you've got 10 or 15 seconds to dodge it. When you're hovering around a tree line or an LZ or picking up a survivor, the guys are basically about this far away or that far away from you, shooting at you, and you can see the muzzle flashes. It brings a whole new different perspective to getting shot at because you're above the tree line and they're all shooting at you, sitting in the cockpit, or shooting at the transmission or shooting at the tail rotor. You've probably heard about the route packs. The way that the powers that be divided up North Vietnam was into 6 route packs. Route packs 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6 were given to the Navy primarily. 5 and 6A, or 6, the ones in Northwest Vietnam were given to the Air Force. You notice those circles with the hatch marks? Those are the areas we were not allowed to go. It also happened to be where all the MiG bases were. And if you notice Haiphong, where the place where all the missiles came in, the ammunition, their fuel came in, that was also not a place where we could drop bombs. The rules of engagement, and I'll tell you a funny story about the rules of engagement, what happened 40 years later in Desert Storm when I was the rotor god for the Persian Gulf. I had 150 helicopters in 14 nations. I had the CSAR mission, Combat Search and Rescue. I had special operations, a bunch of other things. But the rules of engagement we had were really bizarre. When we first got there, you could not cross the beach in a Navy helicopter to go rescue somebody. So that means a guy went down 2 or 3 miles inland. We're not going to go get him. Give me a break. Then they changed it to about 10 miles inland. And then by 1973, it was 25 miles to use your own discretion. During Desert Storm, I got rid of all those stupid things. And also during Desert Storm, when I was in Riyadh, the Air Force guy handed me this sheet of 5x7 cards, which were the rules of engagement. There were 8 of them in 12-point type, 12-point courier type that we were supposed to memorize and give to all the SAR pilots. I looked at this Air Force JAG officer and said, bullshit, pardon my French. And I went back to my boss on the Blue Ridge, and I said, sir, this is unrealistic. And he looked at me and laughed and said, change it. I'll support you. Come up with something reasonable. So I came up with 3. I'm a helicopter pilot. I got to be able to remember these things in times of stress. So I positioned it roughly to scale. You can see how close it was. Always the cruiser that was up on North Star was surface-to-air missile capable. Not well known, but the Navy shot down 5 MiGs from those ships. They would, anytime they came close to the beach, within range, they'd take a shot at them. And so they got 5 of them. Okay, I'm going to talk about a rescue. This is in one of my books. A Navy F-4 goes down, and the pilot and rear seat guy, unofficially known as the stick and blip, but it's typically the aviator and the radar intercept officer was his official title. The Navy called them sticks and blips. And the Navy helicopter was stationed off the beach and decides to go in and pick them up because they were in the water. Granted, they were only about a mile off the coast, and you can see up there at the top where the 2 stars are. The 2 crew members were about a half a mile apart. And the helicopter starts trundling in. Now, the little red wedges there are where the ships would be anchored in Haiphong Harbor. And typically they flew flags of the UK, France, and all the flags of convenience, Panama, Liberia, Malta, whatever. And then there was always ships from the Soviet Union or one of the Warsaw Pact countries bringing arms and ammunition. Typically the Liberian ships, the tankers were out in the middle of the harbor to get them away from everything. And the whole beach area was just covered with anti-aircraft positions that aim primarily to shoot at the fixed-wing air guys above 10,000 feet, but also take pot shots at the helicopters coming in to make rescues. And oh, by the way, the Soviets would claim that their ships were, quote, neutral. Now, we used to see them see the photographs of the holds open. You could see the missile crates in them. You could see the artillery pieces, et cetera, in the holds when they were sitting at the piers in Haiphong, but we couldn't bomb them. So the helicopter starts trundling in, and he gets in about a quarter of the way there. He's taking fire from the beach and starts taking machine gun fire from one of the Soviet freighters, and they return the fire. They used the minigun. The minigun prevailed, plus the M79 grenade launcher, which is like a big shotgun. It's about this big. The barrel's about this long. It shoots a 40-millimeter grenade. The helicopter had high explosive rounds, which is like shooting a grenade. You can get pretty good at it. Most of the air crewmen I knew who did this stuff got really good with it. And so the first freighter got chewed up. The second freighter was doing it, got chewed up, silenced the thing, and they twindled on in thinking, hey, great, we're going to get in there. The first guy they picked told him over the radio that he was having some problems getting out of his chute. If you don't know this, if you can't get out of your chute within about 5 to 10 minutes, it will drag you under. Even if you got your vest inflated fully, it may take 15 minutes. So if you can't get out of your chute or cut your shroud lines, you're gonna drown, and it's just the way it is. So it's one of the reasons we get equipped with shroud cutters. They have a thing called a coke fitting, which you go pull forward and down and pop off the harness. But even then, quite often, if you don't land properly and get the chute off to one side, the shroud lines wrap around your legs, and that's where you take the shroud cutter and cut them. So they went to the first guy who was having a problem. They put an air crewman in the water. He leaps out. What you did was you flared the helicopter to about 10 feet. Somewhere below 10 knots, the guy leaps out. You rock the nose down, pull the collective around your ear, and you depart, and then do a crazy, unsymmetrical zigzag pattern about a mile away. The reason for this is you don't want them dropping shells on the survivor in the water, and plus the fact you want to be dodging as best you can the bad guy's bullets. The air crewman then makes what we call white water, which he does a splashing thing. If you ever in the ocean have somebody stand about 50 feet or 100 feet away and have somebody do this, it's amazing how far away you can see it. You can see it about a half mile. He makes white water. The helicopter goes in. They take the coil, the hoist cable, they coil it up. They have a thing called a horse collar. It looks exactly like a horse collar, except it's yellow. It's filled with kapok, so it floats. And as the aircraft commander rocks the helicopter and flares it, the air crewman lays this thing out like a lifeguard and lays the horse collar beyond the survivor. This is the trick. The air crewman grabs the cable, pulls it in, and takes the D-ring on it and hooks it to his vest, because by now he's got the survivor hooked to his vest. Meanwhile, in the helicopter, because you do not want to hover. If you hover for more than about 10 seconds under enemy fire, you're going to wind up crashing in place, because you will get shot down after about 30 seconds. It's just that bad, and it happens that fast. And all the Army guys will tell you this, that they would dump the troops out, and they're airborne within 10 seconds. So we developed this technique where you flare the helicopter, throw the hoist cable out, dump the nose, and fly away. And so as this thing is railing out, you got the 2 guys in the water, you're climbing, and you yank them out of the water. Oh, by the way, the air crewman hits the high-speed part of the switch, which is 200 feet per minute, and it starts yanking them up. And so they're dangling as they're coming up beneath you, but you get them out of the water, and you're moving. So they get the first guy in the helicopter. He was okay, and he had a dislocated shoulder and some other things. So they went and got to the second guy. Well, the second guy was shooting flares off and pistol rounds because he thought they were ignoring him. And he was shooting. This is the second time that I know this has happened, because the first time it happened to my friend and I in the Caribbean, where we picked up one guy and the other guy thought we didn't know where he was, so he's shooting tracer rounds at us off the Virgin Islands. That was the first time I ever got shot at, by the way. And he was aiming at the cockpit because he wanted to get our attention, which he did in the wrong way. And I see that every once in a while I saw his tracer round go zing, zip. What the blank is that? Anyway, back to the story. So the pilot was okay. So they did the same thing. This time they didn't put the crewman in the water. They just threw the hoist thing out. They waited a couple seconds for him to hook up. Boom, he gets hooked up, gives a thumbs up, and away they go. And they head out, and they came out around the tankers. When they got back they stopped off at North Star, got some gas, and flew back to the USS Constellation and bring the pilot back to his squadron. And also, the helicopter needed some maintenance, and Det 110 for HC-7 was on the Constellation at the time. So they decided to spend the night. And everybody's happy. Hey, good job, you made a rescue. Well, they decided to spend a second night, and the next morning the aircraft commander and his co-pilot were asked to go see the admiral, who has 2 stars in his collar. And when you're in 03 and he's in 08, generally the conversations are one way. You're in receive mode, he's in transmit mode. And the good thing is sometimes you come out with an attaboy. A lot of times you come out with less of your anatomy than you went in with. Generally, chunks of your rear are gone. Anyway, so the aircraft commander goes into the admiral's office, and he proceeds to read him the riot act. Number one, how do you know that you shot up a Soviet freighter? Yes, sir, we did. How do you know that they were shooting at you? Because they did. Well, and then he holds up a recent copy of his Vestia the day before, and Pravda, if you know what those Vestia and Pravda, one was the party thing and the other was the national newspaper of the Soviet Union. The headlines, loosely translated, was American Navy helicopter attacks innocent Soviet freighter. The guys were threatened with court-martials, and ultimately cooler heads prevailed, because the 03, who I know very well, had the stupidity to ask the admiral, but sir, we made the rescue and got everybody out in one piece. The admiral was in transmit mode, not receive mode. So this is another rescue, and this is typical of what my friends and I did. This happened off the town of Vinh. Vinh is about halfway down the North Vietnamese coast. It also happens to be where they have their 2 refineries. So there's a thing called POL in the military, petroleum oil and lubricants. It's a primary target because you blow up their POL, or you cause it to burn. Trucks can't run, trains can't run, and armored vehicles can't run because they don't have any gas or diesel fuel. And this A7 driver went in on the west side of Vinh. Vinh was very heavily defended for obvious reasons. The Air Force guys said it was monsoon season, said we can't go. The Navy H7 guys and their H3 trundled off and headed in to go pick him up. They found him initially, and they found this tree up in the parachute hung up in the trees, and the guy was in a pretty bad way. He had a broken leg, the shin was sticking out of his skin, sticking through the skin. He had a broken back, he had a dislocated arm. He pretty badly messed up. So the air crewman goes in and says, hey, I gotta need working this guy before we can pick him up. Meanwhile, the helicopter's flying around because they were getting shot at. And every time they pulled into a hover, they took so much fire they had to wave off. This was late in the afternoon. Again, it was, I think really good weather. It was crappy, it was overcast, rainy, no moon, stuff like this. And you're flying a dark gray helicopter, so it's hard to see. So the helicopter crew came out, exited, went out, and got gas and went back in. Over the next night, this is the truth, over the next 72 hours, the helicopter crew was in the air 60+ hours, 65 hours. They made 6 attempts. They went out to the Ranger to talk to the A6 guys. This is an airplane that looks like a big tadpole, and it's just basically a bomb truck. And they loaded up 4 of them up with cluster bomb units, and they came in, they followed the helicopter 120 knots into the valley. Keep in mind the A6 falls out of the sky at about 1:30. And so they're doing S-turns to stay airborne behind the H-3. He gets them in the valley. They run up and down the road that was in the west side of the valley, and it lights up with fires as they're dropping these CBUs one right after another, because they're setting off all the stored fuel and gasoline and everything else out there, which unfortunately then lights up the valley like it's daylight. So the H-3 guys get in. They find the survivor who'd moved it because the North Vietnamese were chasing them. And he moved them about 200 yards into a small ravine near a clearing. They put the penetrating thing down. It looks like a big sausage with little wings at the end of it. And they get the guys on on a backboard onto or hooked up to the penetrator. They signal the air crewman to go ahead and hit the high-speed part of the hoist. The aircraft commander starts to pull up. The hoist starts coming up. They get about 100 feet from the helicopter, and the hoist jams. Now, any of you who have ever seen cable from a winch, it looks like it's smooth because all the braided wire. I can guarantee you it's not smooth. And what happened is that the co-pilot got out of the helicopter, went back to the two air crewmen in the back. They literally brought these guys in hand by hand. They still have scars on their hands to this day. They just really ripped. They used anything in the back to wrap their hands with, but they eventually got the guys in the helicopter. Here's the really interesting story about it. The young man who was the air crewman, and this is the one of the things that pisses me off, and I literally after Desert Storm got to change this, but the typical way they would make awards is the aircraft commander got the highest award, the co-pilot got the second one, the senior air crewman got the third one down, and the last guy, the number 5 guy, got screwed. And it happened to be the junior guy, and this guy's name, I won't use his real name, but every time, and I know this kid because he was later in a unit for me, he wanted to be a doctor. Came from a very poor Minnesota family, farm family. He was number 6 out of 6 and knew the farm wasn't coming to him. And so the Navy was a way to go, and they told him you can be a rescue air crewman, get extra pay, and go become a corpsman. Oh my God, I'm going to be on my way to being a doctor. This guy got out of the Navy, after he made E5, applied for what's a program called NESEP. It's a program where enlisted guys can go apply to a school that has Navy ROTC. They get a full scholarship. They have to maintain a B average. They come back in as a commissioned officer. He went right to medical school, became a doctor. The Navy paid for his residency, became a orthopedic surgeon, and he's now retired. But there are not many Navy doctors who wear flight surgeon wings, air crew wings, and have a Navy cross. This man, I still know him. I talked to him. Like I said, he worked for me in one of the units I was in. Is a fabulous, fabulous person. And that's another reason why I say, these kids, you ever meet one, hug them. I promised you one set of statistics, and this is the slide. If you note, there are 270 combat rescues. Combat rescues, by the DoD definition, means that you get shot at during the act of making the rescue. Doesn't mean you're in country. Doesn't mean you're in combat theater. It means you get shot at during the attempted rescue or the actual rescue. There are 270 actual rescues. The Navy, emphasize the Navy, made 50% or half of them. And this is what pissed the guys from the Air Force Academy Association off, because they like everybody to believe the Air Force made all the rescues. To which I say, BS. Now, there's another interesting statistic down the bottom. A lot of my brethren didn't make it back. The Air Force had a much higher loss rate than we did, and it's partly driven by tactics, and it's partly driven by location. They started out in Thailand and had to thunder across North Vietnam at 110 knots, tank, orbit, and then go into the Hanoi Haiphong area, where we were typically right off the coast. So we could dash in, dash out. But we, the United States of America, and 2 other countries, and I will name them right now, the United Kingdom and the Israelis, are the only countries that will expend these kinds of assets to get a pilot back. And there are many, many instances where we lost more people. Have you ever seen the movie or read the book Bat 21 or The Rescue of Streetcar 305, where we lose more people trying to get the guy back than we're on the ground. And this is one of the reasons why, as I've gotten older, I went, you know what I did, even though I was voluntold to be a helicopter pilot and didn't get all the glory, it's pretty cool what we did. So that's the end of my presentation. I've written 5 books. The first 2 are about flying in Vietnam, combat search and rescue. Render Harmless is about hunting bad guys in West Germany. I grew up in West Germany. My dad was an Air Force pilot. I spent 18 years living in Germany. Forgotten, it starts off with a botched rescue from Cherubs 2, and it's about POWs who get left behind and then come back to the United States, and there are people in the government who are embarrassed that they're back and want them gone. And the Inner Look is about hunting spies in the Pentagon. I wrote it after I read a book called Circle of Treason about the hunt for Aldrich Ames and Robert Hansen. They're two traitors that did a lot of damage to the United States. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions. It's a great question. The question is how many hours do we have from the time we finished training till the time we flew our first missions? Including training. To get out of the Flight Training Command and graduate, you needed to have a minimum of 250 hours. I had about 260, and then I got about 60 or 70 hours, maybe 100, before we deployed the first time. That's about, for that day and era, that's about average. The fixed-wing guys, particularly the guys who fly more complex airplanes, get a bit more. But the helicopters are pretty simple. We didn't have a weapon system. We didn't have jammers or any of that kind of stuff that they got to all learn about. We were basically alone, armed sort of, and unafraid, and trying to be sneaky. The question is the H-2 and H-3 had problems, particularly as combat helicopters, and have they solved this problem in the more modern? The answer to that is yes. That was one of the design principles of the H-60. The H-860s that I flew in the reserves had ballistically tolerant rotor blades. They could literally take a 23 millimeter explosive round and not break the blade. The blade would survive. They had self-sealing tanks. They had armor built into the systems. They could add extra armor. They were designed so they're crash-worthy. So if you hit hard, in an auto rotation, stuff like that, the pilot seats were arranged so they'd absorb the shock so you'd survive. They had a lot of things that we didn't have. The H-2 and the H-3 were not designed for combat. Like I said, the H-3 was designed for anti-submarine warfare, and the H-2 was designed to be a utility helicopter. The Navy had given up on combat search and rescue between the Korean War. How many people have seen the movie The Bridges at Tokyo-ri? Okay, this is a great movie. It accurately depicts the doctrine that we developed with helicopters during the Korean War. That doctrine applies, and we actually relearned it during Vietnam, because the way they marshaled aircraft from the air wing, the carrier air wing, they penetrated, picked the guy up, blah, 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 blah. Here's a fun story about this. My new bride, we've been married about 3 months. The night I leave to go to Vietnam, sees The Bridges at Tokyo-ri on the tube, and she watches the thing. If those of you don't know anything about the movie, the helicopter SAR pilot played by Mickey Rooney gets killed in the end. This was not a smart move on her part. Okay. The question was, did we ever get called SARCAP, Search and Rescue Combat Air Patrol, from Sky Raiders or other aircraft? The answer is yes, but here's the more complicated answer. The Sandys that get all the glory, the Air Force A-1 Sky Raiders, typically were orbiting west where the Air Force H-3s were. And then later H-53s. So what the Navy would do, and then it goes back to, again, what's in the movie, The Bridges of Tokyo-ri, they would marshal aircraft from the incoming strike. They'd pull airplanes off that, and any aircraft that had ammunition for the guns or unexpended ordnance coming off the strike from that either the guy got shot down and he was a member of, or from other strikes. So they would marshal that. There's a guy, there's 5 roles in the thing. There's the rescue helicopter, there's a survivor on the ground, there's a guy called SARCAP, and then there's the airborne control aircraft, or sometimes it's a ship who's gathering all those people. And then there's sometimes you have the guy on the ground. Somebody asked me this the other day, and I have about 6,000 total hours, and about 2,200 are flying corporate business jets and light aircraft and stuff like that. So that leaves, what, 3,800? If my math is correct, and that's probably about right. I have about 1,000 hours in the H-2, I have 800 hours in the H-2, about 1,000 or so hours in the H-3, and about 500 in the H-860 and the S-860, and the rest is other airplanes in the Navy. Yes, sir. He said the question is how many times did I have to change my underwear? I will immediately answer that with saying that flying in the military is hours and hours of boredom punctuated by moments of stark raving terror. And anybody who is not aware of what's going on around them is dumb. And have I been scared in a helicopter? Yes. But I will also tell you that when you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, so you're scared going, you're terrified when you've survived and coming back, but while you're there, you're calm as a cucumber because you're busy. You're trying to get in, do your job, and get the hell out. And you start with plan A, you brief plan A, you brief plan B, and you have plan C and D that's outlined in your mind. And if you don't, you're going to die. It's that, because if you don't think that far ahead and have options, because no rescue goes according to plan. Hoist jam, the guy can't get into the horse collar, the swimmer's having problems, he's fighting with the survivor who, because he's scared, he's doing things, he's not letting them do their job, and then they both get tangled in the shroud lines. I mean, it goes on and on and on. The helicopter has a malfunction, you gotta leave, but you don't wanna leave the survivors on the ground in the water until somebody gets out there. It could be an hour. Now make that decision. You wanna stay there and risk crashing, or you wanna go back and leave your guys behind? I would stay. The question was, how has it evolved, the guys who maintain the helicopters over time? Today, and back then, the average mechanic, electrician, avionics technician is somewhere between 18 and 20 years old. You're trusting your life to this kid. And it's still true today. These are very dedicated, very educated, very well-trained young men and women, and you literally bet your life that they do their job right. If they don't, you're going to die, or you're going to have a problem. Today, it's evolved, so no longer are you a mechanic and a rescue swimmer, or electrician and a rescue swimmer. It is now your only rate. So that's one of the things the Navy did. They followed the Coast Guard model. And by the way, the Navy and the Coast Guard run the swimmer program that the Air Force guys come and go through, and then the Air Force runs the parachute piece if the Navy decides to send them, which they don't. Because whoever thought about jumping out of a perfectly safe helicopter? Oh, by the way, there's no such thing as a perfectly safe helicopter. It beats the air into submission. Yes, sir. The answer, the question was, do the Vietnam era helicopter pilots have stability augmentation systems? And the short answer is yes. The corollary to that answer is when they worked. They were not reliable. In fact, I've had the dirty underwear moments more often than not trying to use the auto hover or the auto approach to a hover, because you get down to 40 feet at night, and they have scared me more often than not. The one in the H3 was much better than the one in the H2. And you could trim it and tweak it as you were going down, because you literally would fly it with one hand literally holding around the cyclic, the one stick between legs known as a cyclic, and your other hand right by the collective, and your thumb over the disconnect, or excuse me, a thumb over the disconnect button. The one in the H3, once you engaged it, it started at 140 feet and took you right down to 40 feet, and it decided when it wanted to flare and how it was going to flare and how much power it was going to give, and it could be an entertaining ride. The H3, you could tweak it. If it's going too fast, you could slow it down, stuff like that. It was much more reliable than the one in the H2. I rarely use the one in the H2. I scared myself just too often using it. Much better. But yes, the helicopter came of age during Vietnam, and there's no two ways about it. The technology of the modern military helicopter, primarily the H-860, or the H-60 and all its variants, the H-53, which is flown by the Marine Corps, which was improved, the H-46, which actually entered in Vietnam and then was taken out because it ended service life, came out during the Vietnam War, and then there are a bunch of other helicopters. So what the guys, men and women today who are flying are much better than what we flew. As my father was an Air Force pilot, and I used to listen to stories about what he did in the 1930s and 1940s, and even during Korea, and I thought, Dad, how stupid could you be? Well, I have an F-18 driver who's a son, and he can't go anywhere without GPS, night vision goggles, and an autopilot. He doesn't know how to read a chart. I fly with him in light airplanes, and I hand him the chart, and he looks at me, Dad, what's this? But so, like I said, things change, but it has gotten a lot better. I would much rather fly an H-860 in a combat rescue today than when I flew in Vietnam. There's just no two ways about it. It was faster. It can fly 140 knots, and I think about 20 knots, it's not a big deal. It's a big deal in a helicopter. It's ballistically tolerant. Its entire structure and rotor system is ballistically tolerant. H3, you lose oil, and at the main transmission, you have 30 seconds to get it on the ground, or you're going to die. The H-860s, it's 30 minutes. I don't know, actually. And the reason being is that the question was how many combat missions did I fly? The reason I don't know is because you got to define combat mission for me, because when we're in the Gulf and I'm orbiting off the beach, just circling around, that's not a combat mission. I mean, I'm in the theater. And am I getting shot at? Again, I couldn't tell you because I never counted it. The way I want to get into how they track mission things. I know the Air Force gets really into this and everybody brags about it, but I frankly don't know, and I probably don't want to scare myself. The question was, have I been back to Vietnam recently, and if I had the opportunity, would I go? I'll give you the answer to the first one. The question is no, I have no desire to go back. However, wearing a dark blue suit as a reservist, I was with the 7th Fleet staff based in Japan. When the Vietnamese kicked out the Russians, they came to the United States because the Philippine Senate had just announced that they were not going to allow the release on the base to be renewed, or the bases to be renewed. The North Vietnamese approached the U.S. government and said, hey, do you want to take a look at Cam Ranh and Da Nang and maybe come back? So 7th Fleet was tasked for that. We had, in my reserve unit, had some guys who were actually building contractors and CBs and other people. And so 16 of us went back to Vietnam, and we looked at Cam Ranh and Da Nang. The Soviets had basically destroyed the place. And the decision was not to take them up on their offer. So that was 1988. That was the last time I was there. The question was, is a helicopter trying to make the rescue is shot down, do they send in another helicopter? And the answer is, assuming it's available, yes. With the Air Force, they would literally have this air armada with 3 helicopters, 2 tankers, and 6 to 8 A-1s orbiting west of Hanoi. In this air armada. We were typically single ship, so if we augured in, it would be a while before they come get us, or they'd send. But yes, they would probably send one. But it might take a while. I'm talking about 2-3 hours. Again, the helicopter would have to come from South SAR or North SAR or Yankee Station, and it would thunder along at 110 knots, and it's a couple hundred miles. So you do the math. You're going to be on the ground for a while. It's called survival, escape, resistance if you get captured, but in this case, the most important thing is the last word, evasion. You don't want to get captured. So your responsibility, if that happens, is take care of if the pilot's injured, the survivor's injured, get him fixed and evade, however many of you survive the crash. Question was, as over time, has the loss rate gone down so we don't have to make as many rescues? And the short answer is yes and no. Yes, the aircraft are better, but the missile systems get better. The reason you have fewer rescues is, 1, because of tactics, 2, the reluctance of certain presidents, I won't mention their names, to risk assets. And I could start with Lyndon Baines Johnson, by the way, and Jimmy Carter. And notice the Democrats, sorry. So seriously, the answer is 1, tactics, 2, how you go about doing this and when we strike, and the type of weapons we employ. We now employ a lot of standoff weapons, so you never get in the missile envelope. My son, for example, over Afghanistan would drop what they call a JDAM, and basically had a little, as he said, the yellow brick road on the head-up display in front of him. He'd designate, actually the target would be designated, a data link would come up to the F-18, and interface with the avionics system. It'd say, okay, you're 18 miles from the target, the optimum drop point at this airplane, at this altitude for your gross weight, for the weapons you got on board, and it would then direct you to this thing, and then if you selected auto, it would then start to flash you and the weapon would come off the airplane. Or when it started flashing on the head-up display, you pull the trigger and release the weapon. And you could be 15, 20 miles from the target, okay? So standoff weapons, tactics, aircraft, and tactics I include jamming and spoofing and all those things, which I will not get into because I could get arrested. All those things, by the way, the helicopter community now has some of those things. We didn't for years. Those have reduced the loss rate. But make no bones about it, the guys sitting in the cockpits will go wherever they're asked to go. The big difference between the Navy and the Air Force is the Air Force guys get the missions planned and handed to them and said, go. The Navy guys get to plan them, because if you did what the Air Force does, the next sound you would hear would be clink as guys dropping their wings on the desk. We like to, basically walking away, we like to give us a target, tell us the results you want, we'll go figure it out. Tell us when you want to be there, we'll go figure it out and go do it and come home to our loved ones. The question was, did I ever get to fly the older CH-34? When I got to Ellison Field and in flight training, they offered me a chance to be in the first group of guys to learn to fly the Huey and not fly what we referred to as the big orange shuddering shithouse. It also has a nickname called the Flying Flare. It's also called the H-34. It's a very good helicopter, but the skin was made out of aluminum and a magnesium alloy to maintain weight. If you know anything about metallurgy, magnesium, when it burns really hot, and the only way you can put it out was pour sand on it. So, but the H-34 served very well in Vietnam, mainly because the Vietnamese were shooting at the front, and you had this big radial engine, just like in this T-28, and it stops a lot of bullets. The question was, what was the most hazardous mission I ever flew? And the answer is, some nights coming back from Olongapo outside the gate at Subic Bay, somewhat blitzed. The short answer is, there are a lot of, actually the most scared I was ever in a helicopter had nothing to do with combat. We were coming back aboard one night and we lost hydraulics in an H2 and we had a chip light in the transmission and we had oil coming all over the place. And it was a question, because the H2, if you ditched it and it was not daylight, you probably were not going to get out of it. And we had other mechanical problems. The blades were out of track. I mean, it was a nightmare. We were about 70 miles from the ship when the problem started. And again, the thing that you do in this case is you get down to 40 feet and 40 knots and you creep your way back from the ship. You do the math, 70, 80 miles at 40 knots is 2 hours. Now, we didn't have 2 hours of gas, so we went a little faster, 60 knots. But that was a very, very long period of time. I mean, because we knew that if the rotor blades, if the transmission seized, we were dead. If I had to put it in the water, if I knew it started getting grinding noises, which we started to get after towards the last 2 or 3 minutes, and I was debating putting it in the water. It was nighttime. The chances of us getting out of the helicopter probably pretty slim. So it was kind of, let's put it this way, the term was puckered rear end, the rear end being defined with an A. The question is, do we ever have weather restrictions? The Navy is different from the Air Force. Once you get an instrument rating, the Navy says it's the aircraft commander's judgment to go or not go. One of the joys about flying helicopters, you're generally below all the weather. I use the word generally. When it's 0-0, my son always tells me, well, Dad, you can just stop and read the road signs. I've done that. But generally, I can't remember ever aborting because or not going because of weather. There are some times when I was transiting, like I'm talking about a real life mission, a couple times in cross countries where I've looked at the weather and gone, yeah, I don't really want to do that, unless I was going skiing. Thank you very much. It's been an honor to be here.
Thank you for watching Peninsula Seniors Out and About. I'm Betty Wheaton. See you next time.